I'm Gareth Dern-Smith, and I'm from the Institute of Contemporary Music Performance in London. Anything else? There we are. So this is the title of my talk. Welcome. Well, in fact, this may be the title. I did some reading between submitting the abstract and coming here, so I got a T-shirt made specially, which I'll come back to. So I was concerned that, I don't know, maybe it's just because I know my own work, but the more I prepared it just seemed to be really obvious. But Wenger talked about the forgotten familiarity of obviousness being a good thing. So hopefully, if this is all really obvious, that's all right. Maybe it'll be helpful too. So the crux of my argument or ideas is Lucy Green's contention that identity is intrinsically and unavoidably connected to particular ways of learning. But I've sort of gone a stage further to say that identity is intrinsically connected to all learning. Basically, that's basically what I needed to say. But I'm going to string it out. Also, in order to talk about this, I think it's important to know what I mean by identity. This is essentially what it is: a person's realization of who they are. And I'll come back to realization and unpack it a bit more shortly. This idea of expressing oneself through what we do is identity. And another way of talking about identity is this sense of knowing about oneself, recognizing things about oneself. So, also identity addressing issues of self in context. This idea of multiple identities in different places, different contexts, is very important to my understanding. And yeah, again, lots of people have talked about this, and I like this idea of temporary attachments and subject positions. It's all like multiple identity ideas. I like this idea too, the idea of identities becoming active or inactive in different ways. So you're using one identity, you're not using one identity. I'm a drummer, but I'm kind of hiding that a little bit this afternoon. I've got drums in the background. So I had to slip it in though. And these are people authors I found really helpful talking about multiple identities. Stetson Burke have a brilliant chapter in their Handbook of Sociology, which is fantastic, talking about multiple identities. Great. Oh yes. So this is what got me onto the T-shirt. The idea of context being fundamentally cultural. Context is always a cultural context, I think, at the moment. So meta-identities. I had this idea of meta-identities, which I think of as kind of a larger identity. Like drummer for me is a meta-identity, and it emerges in different contexts. So, like I said this afternoon, I'm not much of a drummer, but I kind of am a bit. So I'm sort of quiet drummer today, whereas I'll be the really obvious punk drummer one afternoon or evening, more likely. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. Different ways, larger identities. Another meta-identity could be teacher, husband. I've not been a very good one this week. I'm not at home. We tried to Skype last night and it didn't work. You know, big identities. So underneath these things, or within them, the idea of contextual identity. So I think these kind of sit under meta-identity, so you can have, I'll just describe both these things. So small identities in context and bigger ones that encapsulate them. So I found these terms useful to think of identity in terms of a history, biography, I know you can read one, you can read them too. Narrative, I think this is a great idea, for an identity is narrative. I like that a lot. A processual thing, or trajectories. I'm not completely convinced by these, which is why I've come up with my own idea. But I like them a lot. These really help me think about how identity is. Lucy Green said that identities can be both constructed and construed. I like that. And Theodora said a similar thing, but called it projecting and introjecting. So, coming back to identity realization, I always use Z's in America, S's in the UK. Pleased with these slides. Passive identity realization. This is the kind of identity realization I was saying when you understand something about yourself, or you recognize something when you understand something. That's a passive identity realization. And the active identity realization is when you go about doing. You go about realizing an identity in the sense of making it happen, creating it. So, brilliantly, P-A-I-R is pair. Passive and active identity, so it's two of them. Quite pleased with that. I just talked about this one, haven't I? Passive identity realization. As an awareness of oneself. That's essentially what it is for me. What Green called construal and Denora's introjection. Discovery. This is important because it sounds a lot like learning as well. When you discover things about yourself, so this is partly why I think the two things, identity and learning, are so connected. Practices, doing, and that's the construction thing of Lucy's, and projection, as I said. Self-constitution, the activity of self-constitution. I like that idea. So what do I mean by learning? As teachers, I'm sure we'll have a pretty good idea what learning is, but you know, it's never a bad idea. I like the idea of a dynamic view of learning, that it changes and it's different, and we shouldn't have a fixed notion of it. And a continuum of learning, or maybe this is a continuum of ideas of learning. I think that's what this is more about. Yeah, how we understand it, how we look at it, how we see it. So Jorgensen's got some great ideas that I rather like. She talks about enculturation. Lots of people talk about enculturation, but she talks about it very broadly, which I really like. I think basically any kind of learning can be looked at as enculturation because we're learning things from the culture we're in. It's the t-shirt. So everything is as part of a culture. And transmission is something she talks about as well. So we learn things from sources and we transmit to sources. So the other thing is acculturation, the kind of learning of other cultures that aren't necessarily ours as much, which I think happens as well and is quite an interesting idea. It's all part of enculturation, but a slightly different kind, I suppose. Which brings me to learning realization, and predictably, I have two kinds of this: the passive learning realization, not the same as passive learning, and obviously active identity realization. Learning realization, sorry, really better than me, which is not as good as pair, but you know. Yeah, I'll talk some more about how these fit together in a moment. So, active realization, is basically any instance of someone engaging with the intention of learning something. If you're going about trying to figure something out, trying to find something out, then you're actively realizing you're learning. There we are. Passive learning realization, this is the one I love because this seems to touch on a lot of stuff, and I really like this idea. Not so much the idea, but what it helps me to think about, which happens reflecting between moments of going about doing things. It's how we pick up on stuff otherwise. What Carlos Rodriguez would call unconscious accumulation, it just disappeared. Come back! No! My goodness. Sorry, that was... Oh no! Excuse me. This is all going horribly wrong. What Carlos Rodriguez is called unconscious accumulation. There we are. Passive learning realization. Okay. Also, it's helpful to think of this in terms of the hidden or tacit or implicit teacher, I think. So we're learning things that, or our students may be learning things that we're not necessarily intending them to learn. So look out for that, I think. I found this really helpful to think about. So, yeah, this is ties into that multitasking thing, I think, as well. And well, it ties in with a lot of things. But there may be learning going on we don't expect. I like this. Even failing to learn what is expected in a given situation usually involves learning something else instead. So sometimes you might recognise that our students are learning things we really don't want them to be learning, but sometimes they may be learning things that it would be helpful if we acknowledge. Of course. Oh, to my notes. Davis and Blair talk about how learning might be, can remain unrecognised and undervalued in education. So just to look out for that. Right. Our experiences at various times in various places effect what we understand and believe about ourselves, i.e. our identities, and our world, which I'm calling culture. I just recently discovered the transitions in England still. Love it. In turn, who we understand ourselves to be and who we go about being impact upon the world around us. So that's the culture affecting us and us affecting culture, because it's all part of the same thing. Which brought me to some questions. Maybe I'm a psychologist. I just completed my PhD in sociology, but I feel a bit like a psychologist, which is all right, but it took me ages. So maybe it's just easy. I know exactly where I stand with this one. This is my favourite definition I came across: a sociological social psychologist, which covers everything that I could possibly be, apart from a drummer. So but this. Margaret Barrett's edited book that just came out, called A Cultural Psychology of Music Education, was a revelation to me. It's fantastic. It talked all about how people, well, there are lots and lots of chapters about identity and learning in context in the cultures that we do it all in, and this was, I think this may be where I sit, and I've submitted my thesis in its past. I can talk about this and have new ideas. She talks about how these things are mutually constitutive, which is a nice term. Next, oh yes, here's my model. Obviously things have to happen in time and space, otherwise it wouldn't be happening. But culture I put right in the middle here because I think it's really important to be aware of it as a cultural psychologist. So here's the model I developed, which talks about the snowball self. It's I have another one in my bag just in case. I can't do that with the left hand; it's really slow. But you know, this one's anyway. So the idea of the snowball self, which someone once told me would melt in Texas, but never mind. It wasn't you, Janice, was it? Okay.
There's another name.
Okay. Right, I envisaged the self as a snowball. Like I said, there's histories and trajectories and things I like a lot. But if you imagine a snowball, well, first of all, the snow is going to be identities and learning, and the self rolling around on different bits of identity and learning and exposing different bits and picking up different bits get covered up and fall off. And these identities, kind of, the meta-identities I've got here, I should use this, shouldn't I? Meta-identities being the bigger identities, and the contextual identities inside them, kind of being exposed as you roll around in different places. So, the different realizations all feeding into the snowball self. That's in the context of time, culture, and space, which I tried to get underneath the diagram, but it kept not working, so I had to put them on top of it. So, all of this came out of some research I did into drummers, hit drummers, and that was my question. How are drummers drummers, and how do they learn to play? And it became immediately apparent, well not immediately, eventually apparent, that these were two very similar kind of issues, how we are and how we learn, integrated. There it is again. It was an ENIC study, I am a drummer, so I have some pictures to prove it. Favourite jacket. And this is me teaching as well. And I just had a small clip to play because I got a bit excited and figured I could do this last night. So, it's only short. That was the title of my thesis eventually. I always ride my glasses before I play with them on, so I don't. Stop. There we are. Okay. So, thank you for indulging me.